Okay, so I'll just recap on how to add a gradient in an Illustrator shape. So we've got a shape here, okay, this path that we've turned into an outline shape. Okay, if we come across the gradient panel here, we can add a gradient to that, and then we can double click on either one of these endpoints to change how the gradient flows. Okay, we can also change whether it's a linear or a radial gradient, so the linear gradient will run from one end to the other. But what we can also do as well is add in other points in that gradient. So if we want it to run from one color to green and then to another color, you can see we can get it to run a different set of colors along there, and we can change the flow of those and how they actually blend into one another using those pointers at the bottom. Okay, so that's how to add a gradient in an Illustrator shape, and that will copy and paste into Photoshop. So if we paste that in, we'll get that gradient in Photoshop. But if we wanted to add a gradient into, just hide these two layers, into these layers that we'd pasted in beforehand, then in Photoshop we haven't looked yet, if we double click in this blue area here, at the layer style palette, which allows us to add a gradient overlay onto a shape, which will give a gradient to the whole thing. Okay, so as with everything in these bits of software, there's always like a number of different ways to do exactly the same thing. So you can see here we're adding a different kind of gradient, but to that whole shape rather than to just one of those lines. Okay, the layer styles panel is quite useful. It's got other stuff in here as well. So we looked at adding strokes in Illustrator, but we can also add strokes here as well. So we can add a stroke to a shape in Photoshop. Okay, change the color of it, and then we've got other options down here as well, things like drop shadow, which I think we have added drop shadows to some things, so I think we've probably come in here at some point before, and then pattern overlays and a whole bunch of other stuff that you can play with. Okay, but yeah, as you can see, it's adding it to the whole layer here. The nice thing about doing it in Photoshop is that we can try stuff out if we're working in Photoshop for our final option and turn those options off in the layer panel. Okay, so we can kind of work with those there.